Hey everyone, it is March 6, 2014, and right now we're going to talk all about Apple's new or newly announced CarPlay. We're also going to talk about some new Samsung watches and what it might mean for the iWatch. Plus, we're going to talk about all the week's news in Apple. This is the iMore Show. Joining me, as always, the managing editor of iMore.com and Internet Bon Vivant, Peter Cohen. How are you, Peter?
I am well, Rene. How about yourself?
I am doing very well, thank you. We also have a special guest, returning guest, family member from across the pond joining us. That is Mr. Richard Devine. How are you, Richard?
Hello, Rene. Hello, everybody. I'm very well, thank you.
You're very well now. I understand you came back with the Spanish plague.
Just a little bit, yeah. Monday and Tuesday this week were pretty bad.
It was really quiet because you were sick, Kevin was sick, I think a couple other people were sick, and it was just a ghost town. Yes,
I should expect every time you go to a trade show to come back with something, but yeah, it was bad this time. Much worse than after CES.
All right, so we'll get to all your fun and shenanigans on the road in just a minute. But you came back, and Apple decided they put out a press release early in the morning. They rebranded iOS in the car to CarPlay, and it's funny because that was sort of a name we were joking about at WWDC because. The scuttlebutt there was that it was sort of a bidirectional version of AirPlay. So if AirPlay went to your TV, maybe CarPlay could go to your car. And Apple actually used that name. I think that is absolutely terrific. It's newly rebranded. The apps look a little bit more refined. And Peter, Richard's going to geek out about this for several minutes, so I'll let you get a word in edgewise first. But in typical Apple fashion, in atypical Apple fashion, this is something that is rolling out in large part out of their control because it depends on car manufacturers.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Apple has for quite some time now tried to control the information about new products and new services by staging their own events. Sometimes these events will peripherally happen while other stuff is going on, but it's always been Apple's to control, and it's been like this ever since Apple kind of stepped away from Macworld Expo a number of years ago and decided, we're big enough now and we've got a broad enough customer base that we really don't need to ride on anyone else's coattails. And within a year or two of them doing that, they had pulled out of every other major trade show that they were in. So it's interesting to see the rollout of CarPlay happen at, of all places, the Geneva Auto Show.
Were you bummed that VW vans and Winnebagos were not included in the initial launch lineup?
Well, it's always something for next year, I suppose.
All right, so Richard, let's get into this a bit. I watched the demos. They've had several of them up so far, and they looked in some ways incredibly slick, in other ways incredibly frustrating. I'll draw your attention, sir, to what looks like a small Radio Shack TV set slammed on top of a Mercedes console, and what looks like the old display from my Trio put into a Ferrari just so that people can use their leather Ferrari racing gloves while using the display. Am I correct?
Pretty much. I mean, the Ferrari obviously they've demonstrated it on an existing car, the FF, so while it's an incredibly expensive car, it's available on the market now with Ferrari's own interface operating system thing, whichever way you want to look at it, and it comes with a really, really horrible resistive touchscreen. So it's kind of like from the Ferrari perspective, it looks like they've just glued another button on that says Apple CarPlay and just off we go. But it's an unusual position to be in because we're used to getting Apple stuff, and Apple controls everything, like you mentioned, from the hardware right through to the software to the sales. And this kind of like new boundaries for them, because while they're obviously controlling ultimately the software experience, what they're running it on is completely out of their hands. And I would trust Ferrari to make a really good car, but I wouldn't trust them to make a really good computer. And I think that's where it's going to get a little bit more frustrating. And we're probably going to see the slightly less than ideal implementations.
All right, so let's talk about the implementations a bit. Peter, this would never have happened if Steve Wozniak was still around. That's not the right way to say that. Hang on. Steve Jobs drove a Mercedes. Scott Forstall drove a McLaren. Eddie Q drives a Ferrari. I believe Phil Schiller drives a Porsche. they have a vested interest in making great car experiences, but just like televisions, where the Apple TV plays to your TV, not like the television. Apple gets a lot of benefits on Apple TV. You just plug in an HDMI cable. It's a standard, and no one has to see anything. You've got a TV panel in front of you. You've got an Apple remote in your hand, or an iPhone or iPad, and they can totally intermediate that entire experience. But cars are nowhere. Cars have a bigger problem because first, it needs to be bidirectional, so the car can send input back to iOS, but also you have to deal with an industry where there are no such standards.
Indeed, and it'll be interesting to see how the CarPlay experience varies from car to car, because we're seeing a wide number of auto manufacturers hop on with support for the CarPlay standard. It's not just one or two luxury brands. You've got companies like Kia and Hyundai and Honda and Toyota making CarPlay compatible cars as well. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these companies have not had a lot of success integrating the use of navigation software and entertainment software and so on into their existing dashboard mounted systems. So I think CarPlay gives them a way of getting something from Apple in terms of a lot of people use iPhones, a lot of people are familiar with the interface, a lot of people are going to have a very short learning curve to get this stuff working. And it's good that it'll be on cheap cars as well as expensive cars, because if this was something that was only limited to a few select luxury models, it wouldn't be very useful to anyone.
I think that, Richard, we have GPS in North America. You have SatNav in the UK. I've been led to believe it's the same thing. We just call it different names. But as an example, it was torturous to update the maps. You'd need often an SD card. You'd have to pay $100 for map updates. The interface would be challenging at best to use. I've seen some of those knob dial ones. They're appalling. How big an advance is CarPlay just compared to what used to be in the cars?
It's pretty huge. I've not yet seen an in-car navigation system that I would be happy paying money for, because let's not forget that a lot of these systems are optional extras. At least over here, there's you could be paying like £1,200 to £1,500 to have an integrated sat-nav system in the car. And while that's great for convenience, and it also adds a little value when you come to sell on, most people these days have if you have a smartphone and you have a free sat nav in your pocket, it doesn't matter which platform you have anymore. Everybody has an onboard sat nav, and I've been using my phone for whenever it was I first got my first iPhone. I've been using some form of mobile satellite navigation software, and the fact that you can just build it now into the car, it's pretty huge. And the videos of the way that it's integrating with Siri and voice activation as well, and just telling it where you want to go, telling it to find a hotel nearby, giving it a point of interest, letting it come up with with that sort of navigation information, just a couple of clicks and off you go. And it's fantastic. Obviously, if you don't have an iPhone, you won't be using it, and I think that's the other great thing to it as well.
So Jan Gold in our chat room is asking, is CarPlay the presentation layer, or is QNX driving the integration between UI and car functions? So there's been a lot of confusion about that, and there's been some really funny stories written about it. The thing is this. CarPlay is a way to connect your iPhone to your car. If you don't have an iPhone, that car screen can't be blank. You can't get into a car and give people a blank screen unless they happen to own an iPhone. There's certain realities that we're dealing with here. So cars have infotainment systems, and something has to drive those. Apple has absolutely no interest in driving infotainment systems for a couple of reasons. First, they don't own the car, so they are not going to license out iOS the way you would license out QNX or embedded Android or Windows embedded for Motor, which is, you might know as Ford Sync or something like that. That's not going to happen. Apple would probably take it over, but they would require it to be iOS only, because Apple only supports Apple stuff. And if the car company said, yeah, you've got to make it support Android and Windows Phone too, I don't see Apple agreeing to that. So I don't see a world that we live in where Apple would control the entire stack for an in-car infotainment system. So something has to drive that. Often that's QNX, and that's the same thing that drove, for example, the iPod Connect. 5 years ago, you'd go in, you'd plug your iPod in, you'd be able to see your songs and see all that information. Something drives that. Something handles the handoff between the iPod device and the car stereo and backwards and forwards. Apple pretty much doesn't care who that is. If QNX wants to do that for the manufacturer, great. If one day that's embedded Android, whatever. As long as it gives Apple the tools they need to make the iPod work, that was fine. And that's carried over to CarPlay. So right now, QNX, which is owned by BlackBerry, does a lot of in-car automotive infotainment systems, and that's fine. If you just get into the car, you'll have that QNX experience. Most phones can connect to that via Bluetooth, some of them by USB, and you'll be able to move things like your contacts, to be able to play your music, do all sorts of basic things, regardless of the kind of phone that you have. What Apple's done is make a special thing that gives greater value if you're using an iPhone, and that doesn't mean that Android can't make their own version. They can't make Chrome Play or Car Chrome or something one day. Microsoft, can obviously do that with Windows Phone, but in this case, Apple is presenting iOS with a slightly different interface to the car, and all QNX or embedded Android or any other manufacturer is doing is accepting what Apple is sending them and displaying it. You can run, Steve Stratton-Smith on Twitter famously was showing off iOS in the car just based on the iOS 7 build long before the cars came out. So all that stuff is built in. There just has to be something that knows how to take that information and show it on the screen. It's not exactly the same as an Apple TV showing AirPlay mirroring, because that's much simpler and it's much more of a standard. But it's also not right to say that there's any other technology powering it. Apple doesn't want you to care. You get in, you plug in your iPhone. If the car is running Android or QNX, that shouldn't make a difference. As long as it knows how to handle the protocol Apple's giving it and send back the information they need. So yes, there's partnerships, but it's Peter, at least my understanding is it's no more or less a partnership than back in the iPod days.
I trust you on this one, Rene. I have no idea.
We'll have to wait till someone hacks it. I mean, eventually some developer will get one of these cars in their garage, they'll take it apart, and they'll say, okay, this is exactly how it works. But based on what we've seen so far, developers have to do very little tweaking. A lot of the Apple stuff is self-contained, as you'd imagine it be, because they're not going to give away a lot of the keys to their technology. And whoever's running the infotainment system is just doing a really good job of putting that on the screen for you. And one day we could have, I want iOS on my Canon camera. I want iOS on my fridge. Not really, but I like the idea of that interface being projected everywhere. Sorry, that was a long roundabout way to get me to say that, Richard, I was not very impressed with those articles about QNX yesterday.
No, I mean, it's obviously when the announcement first dropped earlier in the week, there was a lot of people jumping to massive conclusions about all sorts of different things, like, so how much is it going to cost? I don't want to buy this car if it's got CarPlay in because I have an Android phone, whatever. And it is important. We have to remember that nothing has changed from the perspective of the car makers. They are still doing their thing, which may well be QNX, it may well be Google's open automotive partnerships coming into play. It could be something that Ferrari has built themselves in their factory in Italy. It really doesn't matter what's underneath. The important thing is that if you own an iPhone, you could theoretically go the rest of your life buying new cars with CarPlay in and always have the same exact in-car experience. If you don't have an iPhone, you'll never know it's there. Presumably, we'll hear more about the sort of costs and how people are going to be expected to pay for it going forward. Whether it's going to be like a standard option built into all these cars that's just going to go out there, and if you've got an iPhone, you just plug in. Great, no extra no extra money down. That's fantastic. Or if it's an option that people can tick on the tick when they're ordering the new car. I own an iPhone. I'm probably going to own one for the duration of having this car. I'll tick that box. I'll pay the extra money. I think it's important just that folks that aren't invested in the iPhone just remember that you're not going to be punished for not having one when you go out and spend a lot of money on a new car. It'll just be a Volvo, a Ferrari, or a Mercedes. It'll just be whatever they usually would sell you.
And what? I don't want to, I got accused of being anti-QNX or being upset that QNX was getting attention. That couldn't be further from the truth. I love the fact that Canada has produced, several really good mobile operating systems. I think there's not many countries that can say that they've done that successfully multiple times. And I'm a huge fan of QNX. I was a huge fan of QNX long before BlackBerry bought it. I am not especially proud of QNX being able to run CarPlay on top of it. I am especially proud of QNX making great infotainment systems when people aren't running on top of them. The same way I like Mateus Duarte's Android system when Samsung is not shellacking its way all over it. I like the front end stuff. I like the interface. For users, the interface is the app. They don't really care, nor should they be required to care what plumbing is underneath there. Peter, the one thing I wanted to ask you, though, is immediately the story came out, people started going, oh my God, distracted driving, kill it with fire. Now, I remember when I was in high school, my friends would drive me to school. They would spend the entire time with their head turned in front of the radio, twisting. We had knobs on radios back then, no satellites, it was all AM, FM. Trying to find another song that they liked. They barely, if ever, looked up. That was a huge driving distraction. I remember when I was carpooling to work, I'd see people reading newspapers on their steering wheels as they waited in traffic. I dislike the fact that in our society we pick on individual instances of technology and don't just address the core issue of distracted driving in general.
Well, I think that a lot of state legislatures have taken more of an active interest in passing laws to fine people or otherwise disincent them from driving distractedly, because it is a big problem. And I think that the issue and you're right, I mean, for as long as people have been operating automobiles, they've been distracted and they've gotten into accidents. I remember one of my first jobs out of high school in the 80s, I was working north of Boston, and our local paper had a front page image of one of my coworkers, one of the people who worked at the same company that I did, in the median strip of the highway. She had apparently flipped her car. She was applying makeup.
Yeah.
It's stuff happens, and unfortunately you can't legislate common sense as much as you would like it to. But I think the ubiquity of smartphones it has given rise to the belief that they are a serious distraction problem. And in point of fact, studies have been done that show that up to a quarter to a half of all Americans who operate vehicles have looked at their smartphones, have texted, have otherwise been distracted from driving, which is what they're principally supposed to do. So I thought it was interesting that in announcing CarPlay, talking about reducing driver distraction was one of the things that they talked about in it, and I think that that's good. I think any time that we can take technology out of people's hands and get them to focus back on what's important is good. And the cars that are coming out with CarPlay, are some of them anyway, are going to have a Siri button that's going to be right on the steering wheel. So you press that button and you tell Siri what you want. That should reduce distraction further, although I don't think it'll completely eliminate it. The bottom line is people are going to do what they need or what they want to regardless, but let's give them as low a barrier to entry as possible.
Yeah, that actually made me think, Richard. I don't know how you feel about this. I've used phones that have always listening on, where you can say like, "Okay, Google now." Do you have a sense of what is the least distracting sort of interface? Is it a button on the steering wheel? Is it a knob on the dash? Is it the ability to talk to your phone? What makes them safer?
Yeah, I used to do a lot of driving in a previous job, and part of the when I had a company car and a company mobile phone, part of the agreement was that I had a car kit fitted so that they could always get hold of me, wherever I was. I could never say, obviously, because over here it's illegal to use a phone while driving. You have a phone in your hand, you're in trouble if you get caught.
Tower London with you.
Near enough. But I mean, I had a button that I could just press, and then it would kick into a voice-activated address book thing. So I would press the button. It wasn't very good. It was some janky old Nokia unit from the Stone Age or something. But the idea was that I would press the button, just tell it who I wanted to call. I would never have to look away from where I was driving. It would just be, I knew where the button was. It's the same place every time. Just jab it quickly, tell it who I wanted to call. It would call, and then I would do I would arguably say that being on a phone call is worse than getting on the phone call in the first place. But I don't see how CarPlay is going to be any worse than having your phone in the window, giving you navigation information, or cars over here, a lot of them for years have come with a 3.5mm auxiliary input, so you can plug things like an MP3 player or a phone into the car's existing head unit to play your music through. So you're not telling me that people are doing that and then they're not flicking between tracks, distracted from the road. It's no worse than changing a CD, and I think I told you guys earlier on, unfortunately I got caught speeding about 5 years ago, playing with the radio in the car. This wasn't a smartphone related incident, or of any kind of phone related incident. I was just changing the radio station, and that took my eyes away from an immediate speed limit change and a speed camera. So, and the car came with a radio. So, I don't see how it's making things that much worse.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. What do you think, Peter? I mean, is this a design problem? Like, is it something that we should just never? Like, should we be basically driving around in versions of Monk's aesthetically sealed cages, or is there a technological solution, whether it's heads-up displays or more voice control or better interfaces?
Well, I think part of it is systemic and part of it is societal. I think that we could certainly train drivers better than we do, especially in the United States. I mean, you're Canadian, Richard is Britannic, so I don't know what it's like for you guys, but I know that here in the States, in most states anyway, it's ridiculously easy to get a license, and most Americans consider driving a right rather than a privilege, even though it still is a privilege, and you have to prove that you can do it. But other countries like Germany, for example, have much tougher standards that you have to adhere to if you want to drive. And I think that if we did toughen up legislation around driving and made sure that people who drove took it more seriously and did a better job with it, that might be one thing. But America is a predominantly, automotive-centric culture. We've for the last 50 years.
Car cowboys.
Yeah, exactly. For the last 50 years, it's been essential to our societal makeup. So they're inextricably linked. Having said that, car manufacturers continue to improve technology in cars to make it easier and easier for people to drive. You can go out right now and you can buy a car that can park itself in a parallel parking spot, for example. Or if you want to do it yourself, there are cars that have rear view cameras that will guide you into the space if you are unclear with the basic, dead reckoning that you should have remembered from driver's ed to figure out how to get yourself into that spot. So little things like that, and I mean, that Google is working on self-driving cars, and the worst thing a car manufacturer can do is introduce a really disruptive technology, because it won't work in cars. Just ask Tucker, just ask Ford when they made the Edsel. These were actually pretty innovative cars that flopped completely because they terrified a lot of the people who were used to very different driving experience. You have to very gradually introduce this technology to people over a period of years. Otherwise, they're going to think, oh, this newfangled thing is going to break, or I'm paying for something I'm never going to use, or this car is going to kill me and try to take over the world like the Terminator movies. Whatever people's excuse, they are very resistant to change when it comes to their cars. They expect sort of steady state technology, and car makers have to move slowly in this. I don't think CarPlay is going to change the world. I just think it's going to give people another way of enjoying the not just the entertainment value of their iPhone, but also its navigational ability, its ability to interact with the world around you in a safer way than you can do right now, because, as Richard was saying, your options right now are to plug an auxiliary jack into your dashboard, or maybe if you're lucky enough to have a car that supports Bluetooth, you do it that way, but you're still interacting with this tiny monolith and this little screen that sits in your pocket or might flop around your dashboard. So CarPlay is taking that element of it away a little bit and creating an intermediary interface between you and the phone that hopefully will work out better in the long term.
I hope you're right.
I just want Apple to ship this crap, finally. I mean, we heard about this in 2012 when Scott Forstall was still around.
Was it Series I for Eyes Free or something?
Yeah, Siri, eyes free, exactly. In 2013, we heard about iOS in the car, and now we're hearing about CarPlay, which is the rebranded iOS in the car. I don't give a damn, Apple. Just ship something. But this actually really goes to my point about how glacial automotive manufacturers move when it comes to implementing new technology.
I think that's true, and I was just going to make a joke because in Canada you used to have to take driving lessons before you get a license, and I got sent to the kind of driving lessons like where they threw you off of shoulders and you had to try and get back on, which I always thought was great. But I've almost gotten into accidents just trying to read the freaking road signs. I mean, there's so many things that make it difficult to drive. Let me maybe get into some of the apps that come with CarPlay. So, Richard, you mentioned SatNav before. So you have Apple Maps. A lot of things have been said about Apple Maps. Both Apple Maps and Google Maps break my heart on an almost daily basis. But do you think that Apple Maps, it's going to be a better looking solution, a better integrated solution, but will it be as reliable a solution for people?
I don't think Apple Maps is as bad as people still like to say it is. I think it still has its weaknesses, and away from larger built-up areas, it's maybe not quite as accurate still as we'd like it to be. But you know what? I've used it in London, which is the scariest city I've ever driven in my life, ever, and it's never steered me wrong. Google Maps has done an equally good job, but I've never got lost in London with using Apple Maps. So for me, it's fine.
Peter, they've also got the music app, but not just the music app. There seems to be, that's the one area where they're doing partner plays, and you can use the music that's in your iPod app. You can use iHeartRadio, the podcast app, and several others. How's the music integration looking to you?
Music integration is looking fine to me. It's really interesting. iOS 7 really kind of changed the way that I listen to music in my car. I've had a Bluetooth head unit in my car. Now, I drive a 10-year-old minivan. I've had a Bluetooth head unit in it now for probably about 5 years or so. It's a Sony aftermarket unit. I was lucky enough to have a car that doesn't really have an integrated head unit that's integrated into the dash, so I was able to have an installer pull out the factory system and put in the stock one with relatively little cosmetic shenanigans. And I have gotten very used to being able to play music while I drive around without having any wires connected. But iOS 7 really kind of changed things for me because it introduced iTunes Radio. Mm-hmm. And as much as I like playing my own music, I like being exposed to new things, but I hate the radio, mainly because the radio in my area is crap, and I think the radio in most areas these days is crap everywhere. iTunes Radio helps me customize, stations, quote unquote, that I really want to listen to, and gives me more stuff I want to hear. So, from that perspective, anything that Apple is doing and anything that the car makers are doing to streamline that experience is great. I'm also happy to hear that CarPlay is going to introduce support for third-party apps like Spotify, for example. I mean, I don't use Spotify a lot, but my kids, I have 3 teenagers, all use Spotify almost exclusively.
No Pandora, though, Peter.
No Pandora, whatever. But
What's
so
Pandora?
It's all good. I think that it's going to be a robust experience for people.
Yeah, I'm still hoping that iTunes Radio rolls out internationally. So please get on that, Apple. Yeah, I think you're right. And there was a story in Fast Company about iHeartRadio and how they integrated with CarPlay. And we've heard stories. I think 9 to 5 Mac ran a story about how Bloomberg made their channel for Apple TV. So while none of these things have SDKs the way the iPhone or the iPod have an SDK, or of course how you can develop for the Mac, Apple at least has these tool sets where they can let these specific partners integrate. I don't think I'd want any old app just willy-nilly taking over my car. I see you shaking your head, Richard. Am I right on that? I'd prefer that Apple stick with partners.
Would you really like Netflix to be able to take control of your car? It might be
no,
good.
It's the Flappy Birds is what scares me.
Well, but that's the thing. I mean, there are certain apps that you really don't, speaking about distracted driving, but there are apps that should not be inside a car. Games is one of them, and things that play video is another, because cars with inbuilt DVD head units have fail-safes, which you can get around if you start cutting wires and things, but there are fail-safes in place so that the driver can't view a video while driving. I think there's some really clever ones where you've got one of these funky screens where the passenger in the front can see it, can watch a movie and obviously hear the sound through the stereo, but the driver can't see anything. All the driver can see is whatever's supposed to be on the car screen. And things like that are really important, because if you just let Netflix turn on CarPlay mode, how many people are just going to plug their iPhone in, House of Cards, and that's when we're going to start getting into trouble. And don't even start with Flappy Bird. Just
carry
no.
on, my wayward son, indeed.
Oh.
Yeah, well, the distraction thing brings up, because Peter, one of the apps that is included is Messages. So they do limit what you can do with it. I don't believe they let you read and type them out on your car screen. But like on an iPhone or an iPad, you can have Siri redo your last message, and depending on how the gods of network connectivity are looking at you any one day, you might be able to dictate one back.
Yeah, dictating messages has always been fraught with peril when I've tried it. And
our friend Jim Dalrymple has had famous tweets with "Shut up Siri, shut up Siri, shut up Siri" in them.
Yes, indeed. So we'll see how well that goes.
That kind of stuff I'm less excited about. I understand that there's people, for example, people in Richard's old job who do need to stay in communication while they're traveling. And maybe we need to institute a policy where you get, like I know in the UK, Peter, a lot of the business friends I had actually ended up getting drivers because they found it impossible to actually work. When in the 9 hours it took them to cross UK traffic if they were behind the wheel of a car. But I don't know if that's what it's actually going to have to come to. You're going to have a driver, you're going to have Google drive your car or something so that you can do everything you want to do on your smartphone while driving.
Yeah, well, eventually we'll get to the point where, we can have autopilot on our cars and none of us will have to worry about it. But whether or not we'll be eating pill food by then and, having robots to serve our every whim, I guess, is something that I'll leave to Hollywood to figure out.
So it went by in the chat too quickly. Let me see if I can find it. I think it was, I'm going back, Rob Richmond or somebody in the chat said, what about the upgrade cycles? Now, the idea for CarPlay that's nice is it'll be updated as iOS 7 updates, and Apple is better at updating software than historically the car industry has been doing with new versions of whatever sync toy or infotainment system they had. But you may not have a car that has CarPlay, and it doesn't look like it's going to be retroactive. Like you'll be able to go in and just have it installed. Richard, you think anyone's actually going to change their car just to get CarPlay? I mean, I'm not lining up outside the Ferrari dealership tomorrow. No, I mean,
If I could afford to go and line up outside the Ferrari dealership, I probably would be doing that for the Ferrari, not the CarPlay. But it's a weird thing. I just generally don't think anyone is going to go running out to buy a new car like the end of this year just because CarPlay is going to be in it. It's maybe something to consider when you're upgrading though, and that's kind of the important thing. There's a lot of people who do change cars a lot more frequently than I would, like in the business world. I mean, I used to do 35, 40, 50,000 miles a year. So the rate of change of cars there is quite quick. But with the amount of partners that Apple's got on board with it, it could very well be much easier when you come round to change, to get in a new vehicle to think, I'll get one with CarPlay in, or I'll tick the CarPlay option, or whichever it ends up being. It's probably not something that you should get too excited about, going running out and spending 25, 30, 40 grand on a new car just to get it though.
Peter, do you think that do you think the car dealers, the car manufacturers hope that this is a differentiator for them and someone will choose their car over a car without CarPlay in it?
I'm sure that's the case, and based on my entirely unscientific poll on Twitter, I've found a fair number of people who said that all things being equal, if they were looking at two cars that were more or less comparable, CarPlay would factor into their decision. Personally, I think that's absurd. I'm not that interested in CarPlay. I'm more interested in safety and economy and price, than I am in CarPlay. But look, I'm not going to tell anybody that they're wrong for thinking that. So apparently, it is an important differentiator for some people.
Beck Jr. in the chat room is saying that he's happy there's no third-party apps because it prevents third-party app advertising abuse, which is, well said.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point.
All right, I'm going to sneak in a quick question here because it's sort of I did this list earlier in the week about an iPad Pro. I started thinking about it after our last podcast, like what could make an iPad Pro? Because the iPad Air is a fairly phenomenal tablet, and just making the screen 13 inches, it's okay, but it's not that interesting to me. But if there were other things to it, for example, if it had a deep color display, the way the Amazon Kindle does, if it had a much like maybe a 2-day battery instead of a 10-hour battery. There were certain things, and one of the things that I was asking about was a digitizer. And because we have Richard on the show, I'm going to ask this of you. So this is Jerome Yost. He says, do you think that Apple will ever make an iPad with an active digitizer the way the Galaxy Note has? I know you've seen new Galaxy Notes, Richard. Is that something you've ever wanted in your iPad?
Not really. Not personally speaking. I mean, it's not to say that Apple would never go that route, but they would have to have a reason for doing it. And Samsung's created a device range with the Note. They've created a software suite to go with having that active digitizer. So, the new Note Pro and the new Tab Pros, they look basically identical, but obviously with one of them you get the pen and you get all the pen-specific apps, handwriting, and it's a niche market, but for those kind of people who do want something like that, it's really, really good. The thing I have against it is it's still too uncomfortable on a large tablet. So Samsung's just announced and just started launching a 12.2-inch Note, and that is huge. That is the tablet. I held it up for Alex Dobie to take the pictures when we were at CES. And I had to hold it with two hands to hold it steady because it's big, it's heavy, and something that size, just carry a laptop. It's and it's so expensive as well. When you start ramping up the size with these things, with the extra components, the extra size, the high resolution displays. I think Verizon or somebody in the States is going to be selling one for like $850. At that point, where how much is too much? And the smartphone, the 5-inch, between 5 and 6-inch Notes, the smartphone versions have gone down really, really well. And I think that's because you can still put them in a pocket. You can throw them in your jacket. You can get it out. It's the same kind of size as a little notepad, and you can do all the same stuff, but you can do it in your hand. If you're having to hold something and struggle holding something with one hand, or you're having to lay it on your lap, but even something like the iPad Air, I wouldn't feel that comfortable holding it and scribbling on it with a pen.
The one thing that interests me is I used to use, when I still worked in design, I used to use a Wacom tablet all the time, and I've always lusted after the Wacom Cintiqs, which had the built-in displays. And Tammy Karan actually just did a review for us of the 24 HD Touch version of the Wacom Cintiq display. And Peter, I've seen the MacBook mod books that they had for a while, but as an artist, I like the idea, and I wouldn't need it to be portable. I would just need it to sit on my easel or sit on my lap. I like the idea that I could sit there and just draw on a device, because as good as apps like Paper are, and as interesting as Bluetooth 4.0 styluses are, it's not the same thing as a Wacom-style digitizer.
Yeah, this is true. I mean, Wacom still has a thriving ecosystem because, first of all, they've trained generations of graphic designers and artists to use their products. But, secondly, they've got really good technology. Certainly, iPads are something that a lot of creative work gets done on. I've seen really beautiful illustration and design work done using the apps that you can download from the App Store. It's remarkable what some people have managed to do. But that may be a good place for an iPad Pro. Something in that form factor, something larger than the current 10-inch model. I don't know.
We've got another question. This is an interesting one for you, Peter, and I'll use it as a way to transition. If you are a long-time iOS user and you transition to the Mac, so you're long-time iOS user, brand new to the Mac, are there apps that you would suggest that would maybe give you an easier way into the platform? Would you stick with all the ones that have like the Mac versions of all the iOS apps, or do you think that's not optimal?
I don't find the Mac versions of iOS apps to be optimal. I think that sometimes they're okay to bridge, and usually you can get them really inexpensively. But no, I can't really think of any applications off the top of my head that I would absolutely suggest to somebody who's starting out with an iOS device and then transitioning to an OS 10 device. It's best just to leap in with both feet forward or with both feet and just start using it. One thing I would recommend new Mac users do, that I recommend that all new Mac users do, is get familiar with the help menu. OS 10 has this, Macs famously do, and most products from Apple famously don't include any documentation, any written documentation, except maybe a, terms and conditions thing that everybody tosses in the trash as soon as they get home. But that's not to say that there's no documentation available for OS 10. Help Center has been a cornerstone of OS 10 for a very, very long time. It is context sensitive, so depending on which application you've got open to you, you're going to see a completely different menu. You may see general information about Mavericks when you're in the Finder, but open Safari and you'll get information on Safari. Open Photoshop and you'll get information about Photoshop. And the help goes a long way beyond just offering you a glossary of terms and descriptions of what each feature might do in the application. It'll give you complete full-blown illustrations of what it does, or it will show you step by step. You select this menu item and this thing will happen. So it's very good at sort of bridging that gap, and it's something that even experienced OS 10 users really overlook, and then they get very frustrated because they're not sure how to do something. It's all right there. All you got to do is use it.
And that was from Mark. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Peter, for that. One last sort of funny question to tie in here, and this is basically what Lakewooder is asking. How long until CarPlay gets jailbroken? As soon as the right 14-year-old kid gets his hands on it. That's usually the case with any device. All right, so I want to transition a little bit into watches. We had Jim Dalrymple on the show last week, and Jim's always fantastic, and he started this whole topic of, what do you want to see in a watch? Like, what would actually make a watch a compelling product with you? And he argued that, he wasn't sure Samsung thought about that, or they thought about, hey, we have to have a watch, and just made one. And we saw that last year with the Galaxy Gear, where even our friend, Phil Mickelson at Android Central wasn't that pleased with it as a product. And it absolutely did get better, but it didn't start off from a really great place. Now, fast forward to this year, Richard, and you've just come back from Mobile World Congress. And they not only introduced a new gear, they dropped the Galaxy from it, and they brought along two of its friends. So you have, correct me if I'm wrong, the Gear 2, the Gear Neo, and the Gear
Fit.
Something? Fit.
Yes, they brought three wearables to Barcelona. As you said, they dropped the Galaxy because they don't run Android anymore. So kind of 6 months on from their very first effort, which was an Android-powered watch, the Galaxy Gear. They're back with kind of a full-fat sequel, slightly stripped-down sequel, in that it doesn't have a camera, which is, in my eyes, that should be the premier model. That should be the who the hell needs a camera on a watch? But different story. And then there's the jokes. Yeah, and then there's the Gear Fit, and the Gear Fit's actually gone down really, really well. It won an official MWC Best Mobile Device Award. And obviously I've seen it, spent a bit of time with it, and out of the three products, that's probably the most interesting one, because it kind of looks like Samsung actually put some real thought into it. It's got a beautiful curved AMOLED display, so it fits around the wrist rather than just feeling like it's been slapped on top of it. Obviously it's fitness oriented, so there's exercise kind of apps on there. You've got a heart rate sensor. The big problem is still that it's going to be a Samsung exclusive product, and it's probably why people can kind of draw some similarities to how Apple might approach it, because obviously we're not expecting, if Apple came out with a wearable, that they're going to let you connect it to your Windows phone or your Android phone, or anything other than an iPhone. And so I kind of get why Samsung's doing that. They're in the Android ecosystem. They're big enough to try and make that play. But it is a little bit more thought out this time. They're kind of thinking a little bit more with they're tying it in with the Galaxy S5, which they're pushing with a lot of fitness apps and technology as well. So there's a big fitness thing, but it's kind of a shift from the original Gear. But again, it's still kind of focusing on one particular spot. They've changed the operating system. It now has Tizen, which may be better, may be worse. We don't really know yet.
Does it matter to you, Richard, either way?
not to me. The important thing is it looks exactly the same. We ran a quick, myself and Alex, we shot a quick side by side with the original gear, and the thing that Samsung did do really, really well is they improved on the existing interface. So if you bought one of the first ones, you don't want it anymore, get a new one. It looks exactly the same, and that's an important thing to remember because, again, obviously Apple hasn't done anything yet, but would they really need to put full-fat iOS on something if they did? Does it really matter what's underneath it as long as it does what it's supposed to do up top?
So one of the criticisms, and I haven't seen any of these, so I can't judge this myself, so I'm interested in your opinion, is with the Galaxy Fit that they put a horizontal interface in what's a vertical device. So when you turn your wrist, the interface doesn't turn with you.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. It would be nice. I mean, obviously, anybody who's not seen it, think of something like a Fitbit or a Fuel Band, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it looks like a Fuel Band sort of thing.
It's a wristband rather than a watch. So in terms of like the smartwatch philosophy and using it to tell time all the time, then I wouldn't be too concerned about that because I would only want to wear it when I was at the gym or when I was out for a run or something like that. So you could just quickly kind of flick and see the time. It's when you're trying to sort of scroll through. It's like a side-scrolling thing, and it would have been nice. Whack the microphone. If you could just sort of flick the wrist up and it just accelerometer or whatever and just flip the interface so that you could go up rather than having to constantly sort of. It's a little bit awkward, but that's probably about the worst thing I could say about it. It's actually quite a nice looking little piece of equipment.
So famously, and I'll ask this to Peter just because I think he's not that vested in this one way or the other. Famously, I'm blanking on Eric Michikowski from the Pebble system said that he believes smartwatches are in the Palm 5 days of their evolution. They still do a very small subset of the dream set of features, and arguably the Galaxy Gear was maybe those early Windows mobile devices that had color screens and had 320 pixels. I still don't think we're far enough along. Apple entered when there were already Nokias and Trio Pros and all these other phones on the market. They entered tablets after 10 years of pain with tablet PC. It still feels like it's such early days in watches to me.
Absolutely. The watches that have come out have left more people scratching their heads than have left people drooling after them. I think that I would strongly suspect that it's not even as far as the Palm 5 level yet. We're in the very early days of these things, and it's not proven itself to be a technology that people need or that people want in any significant way. So, we'll see what happens over time, but. More people are wearing fitness bands. I think more people are getting used to the idea of some kind of biometric device that helps them keep track of activity. I mean, I know that I even like using the Nike Plus Move app on my iPhone 5S, to get a sense of how active or how sedentary I am on any given day. Oh, well, I guess I should go out for a walk now because
I've been using _David Smith's pedometer app.
There you go. So I think that under the right circumstances, it can be useful. But just the idea of a watch, I think, people have invested a lot of imagination in what Apple would do with a watch that other people haven't. I'm still trying to figure out what would make me go out and buy one because I don't really want to have anything on my wrist.
10% off all hamburgers.
That would do it.
So Richard,
this bacon on my cheeseburger, I am there.
If it dispensed bacon, if it had a bacon butt, which is a totally unfair question. A lot of people have been saying that Samsung is putting out these watches just to be first. Sort of like how Steve Ballmer couldn't wait to run up on the CES 2010 stage saying HP Slate, trying to get ahead of the iPad. I'm still sticking with this theory that I'm happy that there is a Samsung because whether you like what they do or they don't do, they always seem to find something interesting like water resistance or maybe the stylus or the digitizer that at least makes me feel like there's motion going on in this space.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it always takes somebody to kickstart it, and I think just because of how things have gone in the last, in the last few years, automatically everybody's assuming that Kickstarter should be Apple, but
they never kickstart.
No, well, I mean, why should it? I mean, they came along with the iPhone, and they changed. Okay, they changed the way that we generally look at smartphones, and again, same with tablets. But they waited till the right time to jump into an existing product market. The smartphone wasn't new when the iPhone came out. The tablet wasn't new when the iPad came out. They could take as long as they like, as long as they get it right when they do it. And yeah, fair play to Samsung. I don't really like the Gear stuff, mainly because I wouldn't want to carry a Samsung phone. But you know what? They're trying it. If they sell some, great. They're such a big company. I don't think it really takes that much off their bottom line if they just discontinue it and try again with something new in another 6 months' time.
It's a rounding error on their toilet business, basically.
Yeah, TVs keep everything else going.
All right, so apparently the iTunes Festival app is out. iOS 7.1 did not come along with it. I wish iOS 7.1 was out already. I think the resprings alone would have been reason enough for Apple to push out, if not iOS 7.1, then some sort of maintenance build in a reasonable amount of time. I'm kind of sad that it's not out already. I don't care about iOS 7.1, but I think a lot of the bugs that people have been living with since September should have been dealt with much sooner than they were. So I'm holding on for iOS 7.1. But Peter, I know this stuff's not easy. I know there's a million cats you have to herd, but I need some relief.
Well, I think you and a lot of other people, Rene, we're waiting for this to happen. And anybody who's seen, for example, the springboard problem, with their iPhone or with their iPad, gnashes their teeth every time it happens, despite having updated several times since 7.0 came out.
We're at 7.0.6 already. They fixed the Gmail issues in Mavericks faster.
I know. So, all right, Apple's update process isn't as smooth as we would all like, but look, it could be worse. We could be stuck with Android devices.
You're saying that for Richard's benefit, right?
That's right.
Richard, any take on the 7.1 or the resprings or anything?
I just want them to go away. I don't care whether it's 7.1, 7.0 anything. Just make them go away. It's spoiling the experience, and the fact that it's been going on for so long now, it doesn't feel like something that I wouldn't have expected Apple to leave it this long, and they've released such small point upgrades for they've released one to fix something in China, they've released obviously the security one which we needed to get, but they fixed something in China, but they haven't fixed all the problems that have come before that. And I mean, for me, it's daily. I'm 3 or 4 resprings. Safari works like absolute crap. It constantly freezes, apps crash, and it's just not the experience it was when even when iOS 7 came out. It seems there's kind of a bit of a backward step on that front. So I don't care what they do. I don't care what else comes in 7.1. I just want my phone to stay on and work properly.
The blue screen issue. Now, I don't know if the resprings are so deeply routed that they had to change the fundamental way in which some of the windowing servers worked, and they decided they could only do that in a 7.1. But then still, kick that sumbitch out the door sooner. I mean, it's horrible. Let's get that done. On that downer of a note, Peter, any games or apps you want to recommend before we go?
Geez. Apps. Well, Richard just turned me on to one. That new webcam app is pretty cool, webcam settings. But no, I don't think that's got a lot of appeal for people broadly. Yeah, as a matter of fact, on the games front, if you are into racing games, and Richard, I know that you are, there is a new game from Feral Interactive, F1 2013. My advice to you is to buy it from Steam or Mac Game Store or anywhere besides the Mac App Store, because you're going to be able to play online against up to 16 other opponents, either on the PC or on the Mac. If you do it on the Mac App Store, you're limited specifically to split-screen offline play, which seems kind of lame to me. But brand new game, should set you back about $50. Looks real cool. And by the way, Feral is really good about supporting game controllers. So if you've got a gamepad, a USB gamepad, or some other gamepad that'll work on your Mac, it'll be awesome. And if you're lucky enough to actually have a steering wheel for your Mac, that'll work too.
Ooh, there's something for the shopping list.
There we go.
Steering wheel for your Mac.
Momo, force feedback, baby.
Oh, don't tempt me. Don't tempt me.
We had an email, and you can reach us, by the way, to ask us questions. You can just put a hashtag #AskIMore on Twitter, or you can email podcast@imore.com. And we got an email here, and it doesn't have a real name, so I'm not going to read out the crazy alias on it. But the gist of it was, did we see Tim Cook at the shareholders meeting, and wasn't he a badass when he was talking to the climate change people? And to unpack that, if you hadn't had a chance to see that yet, Apple had their annual general meeting for shareholders. Tim Cook took questions. One of the questions was from a right wing, and I don't know what that means because I'm Canadian and my right wing is the Liberal Party, so whatever that means. Some right wing think tank said that, wouldn't Apple be better off not wasting money on environmental concerns or so-called climate change or something? And Tim Cook's response was absolutely badass. He said, it's not always about return on investment, ROI. When Apple makes features for the blind, for example, he said they don't give a damn about ROI, and when they do things that they believe are better for the planet, they don't care about ROI either. I don't think he was phrasing in terms of Apple wasting money on it, but that wasn't their primary concern. Now, one of my things with this is, Peter, I think one of the biggest disservices that people do is they say that we're killing the planet, we're destroying the Earth, yada, yada, yada. No, the Earth will be just fine, the planet will be just fine without us. Cockroaches and plants will be in heaven if we were to be annihilated from this Earth. It's us that we have to worry about, and whether you believe in climate change or not, we are amongst the worst behaved animals on this planet. We're not good earthly citizens. And if Apple is spending a little bit of money, if they're breaking even, whatever, to make sure that they're using materials that are recyclable and that we're being just a little bit kinder to this place that we call home, I'm all for that.
I agree with you, Rene. What was interesting to me is not so much what happened at the shareholders meeting, but what happened in the wake of it. The group that made the request for what they were asking for specifically was added transparency from Apple. They want to know, they want numbers on how much Apple is spending on green initiatives, but they showed their political bias right away by calling it so-called climate change or so-called global warming. And then they really misrepresented what Tim Cook actually said to them in their sort of public response to this. So, hey, look, somebody got up on a soapbox and said something used the Apple shareholder event for some political capital. Big whoop.
Richard, you're a hippie from the UK.
It's not something I particularly look too deep into, but yeah, I don't see anything wrong with it. At the end of the day, it's going to become more and more of a thing. I mean, and my old employer was starting to go down green routes for various different things, and it's just the sign of the times. We move forward. Let's not totally trash the planet. If Apple wants to do something to try and save it, then good on them.
And kudos to you, right-wing think tank, for getting Tim Cook to display an emotion in public.
Yeah, that's a first.
He is definitely ice to Steve Jobs' fire. All right, that is all for us for this week. If you joined us live, I would like to thank you. That is absolutely the best way to enjoy the iMore podcast. We are here every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. If you can't catch us live, you can also catch us on recording. We still haven't gotten the video podcast feed back up and running. We're trying to do that as fast as possible. But there's the audio podcast you can find on iTunes and on RSS, and you can find all of the videos at youtube.com/iMoreVideo. Peter, where can people find more of you and more of your Twitter witticisms?
On Twitter at Flarg, Flargh, and otherwise at iMore.
And Richard, if people want to find out whether or not you really are the Stig, where can they go?
I am usually on iMore and Android Central every day, and I spend a lot more time on Twitter these days as well, at Ricka666. I'm
sure you're on the Googles at plus Richard Devine.
Yeah, you'd search for me and look for my mugshot. It's the best way to find it. Somebody stole my vanity URL, so I don't have the I don't have the luxury of that.
Oh, well, we'll complain bitterly about that on Twitter.
Absolutely.
You can find me on all the social things at Rene Ritchie. You can find all of us at iMore. You can email us at podcast@imore.com or just shout us questions with hashtag AskIMore. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, chat room. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Richard. Have a great day.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
That's the news, and we are out of here.